As I put together these videos here at the end of spring, kind of getting into the beginning of the summer, predictably they start to shrink a little bit. There's just less to discuss in terms of the day-to-day weather and the forecast, particularly in the western U.S. as you get into summer. There's still some things to talk about. We'll talk about La Nina and its developments as we go through the summer, potentially some wildfire risks, which I think in some areas are going to be more advanced this year versus others. We'll take a look at that at the end of the video. But if there's that point when there's going to be less to talk about, we haven't reached that spot yet, if you will. Not here in late May. What is it? It's May 29th here at this point, so it might have to go further into June. I say that because, looking through it, there's quite a bit in the forecast, I think, to talk about both maybe early next week as we're looking at some precipitation come through the Pacific Northwest, and then maybe something of a pattern shift going out into next week. Don't want to spoil it too much. We'll get to here in the video, at least looking down across the western region today. Not terribly too much to look at. Now, as I say that, I can see some thunderstorms bubbling here, far northeastern Idaho, southwest Montana. Storms going up really along the front range here today. If you look further toward the west, you can see these high cirrus clouds here. Probably a little bit hard to see on the recording, but those are, following upper level winds in the atmosphere moving, from the northwest toward the southeast, if you will. If you look at the high clouds over, let's say eastern Montana here, if they are moving in any direction, that would be maybe toward the northeast here. Some of these kind of high wispy cirrus clouds emanating from the thunderstorms there. And that's painting that trough axis that's flowing over the northwest right now. That trough is influencing the stormy weather that we have over the eastern part of the region. Underneath the trough, some of these very light rain showers here in the Willamette Valley, even parts of northeastern Oregon, and then eastern Washington as well. So we do have a trough here lingering on Wednesday afternoon that we'll have to talk about here for just a second. If we shift down, this is over the southwest. Can see those front range thunderstorms extending down through Colorado and parts of New Mexico. We actually have a tornado warning here for what looks more like a land spout tornado versus anything else here just east of Denver. Other than that, looking across the southwest, not too much to talk about. Not seeing as strong of a May gray signal here with the marine layer just offshore of Southern California there. If we look at the upper level winds above our heads here analyzed, you can see that trough. We kind of drew it out just before just being able to look at those high clouds. You can see that trough situated over the northwest. So likely bringing temperatures down across the northwest, at least here into today, into tomorrow. Ooh, big zoom out there. And I want to go ahead and show you a loop of those temperatures. This is from the HRRR. It's a short-term forecast model. I'll make it valid here as of Wednesday afternoon. See where the temperatures are here in the afternoon. I'm going to play this forward through the night tonight, and you can see those temperatures dropping into Thursday morning from much of the northwest. We warm up tomorrow on Thursday, but still underneath that trough going into Thursday night. There they are falling again before warming up on Saturday. So restart the loop there. You can see underneath those the influence of that trough, those colder temperatures moving in tonight. If you look at the overnight lows from the National Weather Service forecast here, you can see mid to upper 30s here in eastern Washington. This has prompted frost advisories for eastern Washington, Spokane. Actually have freeze warnings in the counties just to the north of there. But just a cool night ahead, and then I think tomorrow night as well for some of these areas. You can see high 30s, low 40s here across the Snake River Valley, Willamette Valley talking low 40s, and then high 30s, low 40s in northwest Montana. If I take this into tomorrow night and Friday night, warming up a little bit in some of these valleys here, but you can still see those mid 30s lingering in eastern Washington, maybe parts of far northwest Montana, prompting a little bit of a frost risk in those areas there. No frost further south than that I think they'll have to worry about, but just some cooler weather coming through tonight and tomorrow. If we look at those departures from average rather than those raw forecast values, so just kind of color coding it, but by the temperatures that we typically get in late May here, I think it paints the story of where our temperatures are going a little bit better. These are the minimum temperature anomalies for, again, Thursday morning tonight. You can see this area here kind of overlapping with where we have those frost and freeze concerns. If you go into Friday morning, you can see those kind of lingering, but we're starting to warm up here in California and Nevada. And then ultimately by Saturday, looking at a different sort of day here across much of the northwest. So as that trough exits to the east, we build back more late May, early June type temperatures as we turn the calendar page heading into June here of 2024. Take this forecast into Sunday, a continuation of that warmth. more so on Monday. And then ultimately, I think we have another system here coming through the Pacific Northwest that we'll have to talk about, bringing temperatures back down just a little bit early next week. I will make this forecast. These are the upper level height anomalies. In fact, if we look at this trough here over Alberta, parts of Montana, northern Idaho, northeast Washington, that's kind of outlining where we were just discussing that trough moving through the northwest. This has been kind of a common setup, maybe not quite exactly like this, but in the sense that we've had a ridge over parts of the North Pacific and troughing over the western U.S. It has been something we've talked about quite a bit through April and May. I'm going to take this forecast into the future, and we already discussed kind of the first piece of that, which was the weekend aspect of this forecast. And that trough, as we go through Friday and Saturday, is going to be exiting the western region. As it does that, it's going to allow some more seasonal temperatures, a little bit warmer than average, to build in across the western region. But if you look toward kind of the left or the northwest part of this image here, you can see this very kind of what we'll call more zonal type flow. And what I mean by that is we have lower temperature or lower height anomalies in the far North Pacific. In the North Pacific, you have these higher temperature anomalies, and that gradient that you can see there between the higher height anomalies and the lower height anomalies near Alaska is going to strengthen the jet stream over the Pacific. And when we talk about a strengthened or extended Pacific jet stream over the Pacific, well, that tends to be kind of a wintertime conversation or something we associate with atmospheric rivers. Well, it turns out if you do this in late May or early June, the atmosphere doesn't really care what month it is. It's going to do what it's going to do. So we have a something of a Pacific jet extension and strengthening here going into Sunday and then early next week for parts of Washington and Oregon. That seems to be the focus as to where these forecasts are in terms of the precipitation, just with that extended and then that, again, magnified Pacific jet stream. And as a result of that, now we're looking at precipitable water here. This is a forecast from ECMWF of total moisture in the atmosphere. I'm going to play this forward here through Wednesday, now into early Thursday morning, and just keep an eye over in this area of the North Pacific as we continue to strengthen and extend that Pacific jet stream over the North Pacific. We start to bring moisture toward the west coast. This is a kind of your typical atmospheric river type setup, not typical for what we'd be discussing maybe in May or early June, but it can happen. We've seen it before. And at least as far as this forecast from the ECMWF is concerned, here you have your extension, your atmospheric river flowing right in toward the Willamette Valley, parts of western Washington, maybe even parts of central Washington and central Oregon as well. And this would come through Sunday p.m. into Monday a.m. So take this forecast out into the future, weakening as it extends further south, and then maybe just another small shot here as we go through late Tuesday into Wednesday before I think the pattern shifts more wholesale. Before I talk about that, which is more further out into the next work week, I do want to discuss a little bit more of that atmospheric river event that is pretty anomalous, especially for early June here, June 2nd, June 3rd. So here's the forecast from the ECMWF for precipitation. This is valid as of this afternoon here. You can see those thunderstorms we were talking about here showing up well in southern Montana. Those very light rain showers in eastern Washington, western Washington here showing up in the forecast there. If I take this forecast into Thursday and Friday, we talked about that trough exiting. So as a result of that, not seeing as much precipitation to talk about through the weekend. Remember, I just played that loop showing that atmospheric river event trying to encroach toward the Pacific Northwest as we went through Sunday. And it just turns out that as we look at Sunday evening now, heavy precipitation moving into western Washington and starting to push into coastal Oregon and even getting into the valley a little bit here as we go into Sunday p.m. I think that increases in coverage and intensity across the Pacific Northwest as we get into Monday morning, talking about heavy rain, especially in some of these coastal areas, but including some of the valleys as well. That continuing into Monday afternoon before exiting east across parts of northern Idaho and far western Montana through late Monday evening. There was a little bit of that second wave, if you remember that, trying to come through late Tuesday into early Wednesday. Could bring another shot of precipitation to the what we call the far Pacific Northwest, far western Washington, maybe far northwest Oregon. That's getting pretty far out into the forecast. You're talking Wednesday of next week, which would be June 5th at this point. Beyond that, looking at much more established ridging pushing into the western U.S. So we're going to have, I think, much less precipitation to talk about next week. But after that atmospheric river event, the conversation shifts maybe more toward heat as a concern. than anything to do with rainfall. We get the 7-day precipitation anomalies, again, from that same ECMWF forecast. You can see the focus here from that atmospheric river event more on the Willamette Valley, the Cascades, the coastal ranges here in Washington and Oregon, the northern Cascades here as well, looking at an anomalous event, certainly for early June. Rather than looking at the anomalies, if you look at the raw rainfall forecast totals, this is from the WPC, from the National Weather Service. You can see looking in excess of 2 inches, potentially significantly more than that in some of the northern Cascades or coastal mountain ranges here in Oregon and Washington. I think for some of the valleys, the SeaTac area, the Willamette Valley, looking at 1 inch, maybe more in some localized spots. Now, compared to maybe some of the biggest events we can get, in the winter or the springtime, this wouldn't necessarily compare as a huge event by any means, but certainly for early June, talking about some anomalous moisture pushing into the area, and then including some of these areas further toward the east as this system ultimately makes its way through the west on Monday and then Tuesday of early next week. If you had some questions about snow, unfortunately, it is early June, so looking at just the bare minimum here, apart from some of the tops and peaks of the Cascade volcanoes here, you can actually see some of those kind of poking out there in terms of the snowfall. That's really all we're talking about, save for maybe some of the littlest areas here in the highest elevation peaks of the northern Cascade range. Now, I talked about that pattern shift potentially after that atmospheric river event, so I'm going to make this height anomaly map, looking at the upper levels of the atmosphere. I'll make it valid as we go through early next week, and that's showing that extended Pacific jet stream, that gradient between the lower height anomalies and the higher height anomalies, kind of focused right on the Pacific Northwest. That makes sense. That's helping to fuel the precipitation that we just talked about in the forecast. So I take the forecast now into Wednesday, Thursday, and then Friday. You can see this heights building here across the Northwest and really across the West region as a whole in terms of an anomalous ridge pushing into the area. That's going to likely bring heat into the area, maybe enough here in June to be some concern in terms of a heat wave. And it's also likely to keep precipitation out, except for maybe some of these thunderstorms that develop during these heat waves along the mountain ranges here. If you look at the ECMWF forecasted high temperatures for Thursday afternoon, well out into next week here, we won't take these verbatim. I think it gives us an idea of how hot we're talking about. You're talking triple digits and beyond here in the lower Colorado River Valley, southern Arizona, 110, 111 degrees Fahrenheit. San Joaquin Valley, we're talking the potential to get above triple digits, perhaps maybe a little bit more above that in parts of the San Joaquin Valley. But you can see those temperatures rising in the Sacramento Valley as well, temperatures rising along the coast. This would likely go a long way toward pushing out, helping to burn off some of that marine layer that we've seen being pretty persistent here across Southern California and some of the Central California coastline, but even potentially looking at mid to high 90s here in parts of the Snake River Valley, eastern Washington, mid to high 80s in the Willamette Valley. As I say all this forecast, we're at Thursday of next week, so it's now an 8-day forecast. You can't be too confident. We've seen these models shift around in that same time period before, but there's enough agreement here that, well, maybe I can't forecast, an exact temperature or Fahrenheit amount for any one city. I'm guessing that as we go through the work week next week, we're going to see temperatures elevate and, just hoping for not too extreme that we're talking about a more serious heat wave, but definitely looking unlike what we saw in April and May, where we just had this kind of persistent cooler weather to talk about. This looks more like an established upper level ridge that's going to change the pattern around a little bit. And kind of a big question on my mind as we go into June, this is a time of year, we see it time and time again, where that pattern that we seem to be stuck in spring, whether that was April or May, we've talked about how persistent that pattern was, it starts to break down. It starts to change into what ultimately becomes maybe an early summer pattern that sticks around a while. And so, my first thinking and looking at some of the forecasts here for the ridging next week is that the pattern that wants to stick around a while? Is June going to be this much hotter month than we saw, say, in versus May or April of this year? And I'll just kind of walk you through some of my thoughts here. The first thing that jumps out to my mind in looking at some of the sea surface temperature anomalies here across the Pacific is all this anomalous heat here north of Hawaii. Let's call this the North Pacific kind of heat blob, if you will. To the southeast of that, we have a lot of cooler temperatures off California. This has likely played a role in some of the May gray we've talked about. I think it's played a role in bringing some of the troughs into the western U.S. at times in spring. that we've talked about. One thing, we've been watching closely is how much this has crept toward the northeast. This kind of blob, if you will, has been nosing its way closer and closer toward the Washington and British Columbia coastline. If it continues to do that, and it gets above or north of the cooler water here, west or southwest of California, I think that would likely push more atmospheric blocking into this area as we go through summer, and that's how you get, unfortunately, into some of these pesky upper level ridges that just park themselves over British Columbia or the Northwest or the Pacific Northwest, building in those kind of Seattle, British Columbia heat waves. Now, I'm not quite seeing that yet. The potential is there, just given that this trend has been to push this water more and more toward the northeast. That is kind of one scenario that we're watching here in June to see if that kind of hot, kind of more ocean heat content pushed over these cooler waters brings more atmospheric blocking. That blocking tends to be a source of, unfortunately, persistent heat waves in the western U.S. If we look over at the ECMWF ensemble forecast, looking well out into the forecast, getting closer now to mid-June, we still kind of see that signal, unfortunately, from the ensembles with now troughing over the North Pacific, which is kind of unlike what we saw in May, and more ridging here over parts of British Columbia, Washington, northern Idaho, northeast Oregon as well. So unfortunately, some model support well in the long range. We know we can't put too much confidence in these, but there is support there that perhaps this ridging is going to become more commonplace in June, which I think would open up this area to more heat concerns as we start early summer here. If we jump over and get a little bit of a different opinion from the GFS ensemble forecast, this all the way out into June 12th, that ridge parked a little bit more over the interior west or the continental divide, maybe centered more over Idaho, eastern Oregon, southwest Montana. I think this would be less warm for British Columbia going through June, less warm for Washington, and more warm for the interior west, which lines up a little bit more with some of the long-range forecasts that we've talked about going into this summer. I'll just kind of share one of those here from the ECMWF, this forecast for temperature anomalies from June 5th all the way out to July 5th. You can think of this like a June forecast from the extended ECMWF model here. And you'll notice that warmth is more centered, again, over the continental divide, which runs something like that here across the Front Range, and maybe more the interior west, but less or so here over the Pacific Northwest or for California. This has been kind of this persistent signal that we've seen for a number of these long-range models. Now, this is kind of the fork in the road here. Are we going to see more heat build into British Columbia and Washington as we go through June and maybe even into July, or is it going to stay here over the interior west? If this develops here in this kind of more northerly configuration, I think that could, if it lasts, later in the year promote a stronger monsoon season. Whereas if we get the ridging here over the continental divide or the interior west, I'm not sure we see, a more active monsoon season. If anything, it could be a delayed start or a weaker one. We'll have to see how this develops. I wish I had more firm answers for you in terms of the June forecast. But both scenarios advertise warmer conditions for the western U.S., certainly warm in this area here, which did not get the most tremendous amount of snowpack out of the winter that in the spring that we just came out of. As far as precipitation goes across that same time period, that June 5th to July 5th forecast from the ECMWF, you can see I don't think, kind of regardless of the pattern here, not a good situation to get a lot of precipitation if we're talking about ridging and atmospheric blocking and less troughs over the western U.S. So kind of predictably getting into this dry area of summer, but it could be even more dry than a typical kind of June and July period that we're going through, which certainly prompts some concern for wildfire as we go through the year. The latest wildfire outlook here from the National Interagency Fire Center shows increased wildfire concerns for parts of the Pacific Northwest here in western Washington, parts of the interior west, southern Idaho, southeastern Oregon, Nevada, parts of Montana, I should say Oregon, and then parts of the Four Corners area. I think this kind of highlights those two areas we just talked about, with potentially seeing more ridging, more warmth, more heat waves as we go through June and July, which would increase the wildfire risk predictably later in the season. One area we're less concerned about it, just because of all the rainfall we've had, the cooler temperatures going through April and May, would be parts of California. So fortunately, some of these areas, which in recent years saw some massive fires, hopefully, and the forecast remains, or at least this outlook here, for a less active wildfire season for parts of California. We just jump that out and look into the August outlook. Again, getting kind of into the peak season, this would be the area of concern. I'm curious to see where they go with Hawaii. Hawaii did not get kind of as severe of drought formation at the end of El Nino like we would typically think in a given year. In fact, I think it was just last week that we were talking about rainfall moving through parts of western Hawaii. So might not see as concerning of a season this year, but at least for now from this latest May forecast from the Fire Center, still above average concerns going through summer. Their latest forecast will come out just in a few days here. I'll share that with you all next week. We might see some improvement here in terms of the outlook for Hawaii. I don't want to speculate too much, but they did get a lot of rainfall, especially in some of the western islands here. That's my last slide. Thank you for watching here today, and I'll talk to you all next week.